It was a chilly evening when the pastor stepped out of the church doors, his breath visible in the cold night air. The small town where he lived was quiet, with only the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. He often stayed late working on sermons, praying, or just offering his time to anyone who needed him. Tonight, though, something was different. He had just finished a meeting with a couple who had come seeking guidance about their marriage. As he stood outside the church, the crisp evening air felt even colder, but he wasn't ready to go home yet. His heart always pulled him to stay a little longer, to make sure he was available for anyone who might need him. As he walked along the path, his eyes caught a figure huddled near the church steps. The boy was small, with ragged clothes, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his oversized jacket for warmth. He was sitting against the stone wall, shivering from the cold. His face, pale under the dim streetlight, looked lost, far away, as though he had no idea where he was or where to go next. The boy was alone. The pastor stopped for a moment, watching the child in the darkness. He could feel the familiar tug in his heart, the same tug he'd felt when he first started ministering in the town. It wasn't just a sense of duty that made him pause. It was something deeper, something human. In that moment, he didn't see a boy who had run away from home or a child with no family. He saw a person, a soul in need, and that was all that mattered. He walked toward the boy, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. "Hey there," the pastor said gently, his voice warm despite the chill in the air. The boy looked up quickly, startled, his eyes wide and wary. "Are you all right?" the pastor asked, crouching down beside him. The boy's eyes darted around as if looking for a way to escape, but there was nowhere to go. He didn't answer right away. The pastor's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on his shoulder in a reassuring way. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "My name is David. I'm the pastor here." The boy didn't say anything for a moment, but then, in a quiet voice, he spoke. "I'm fine." His words were hesitant, but there was a crack in his tone that suggested otherwise. The pastor could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the exhaustion, the fear. It was clear that this wasn't just a child sitting out in the cold for a moment. There was a deeper pain there. David didn't press him further. Instead, he stood up slowly, offering his hand to the boy. "It's too cold for you to be sitting out here by yourself. Why don't you come inside and warm up for a little while? We can talk, or you can just rest. Whatever you need." The boy hesitated, looking at the hand for a moment before slowly reaching out to take it. His hand was cold, almost like ice, but the pastor didn't mind. He helped the boy to his feet, guiding him gently toward the church doors. Inside, it was warm, the comforting smell of wood and old books filling the air. David led the boy to a small sitting area near the back of the church. He sat him down and quickly returned with a cup of hot cocoa from the small kitchen he kept in the church. The warmth of the drink seemed to ease the tension in the boy's shoulders as he took the cup with a faint thank you. The pastor sat across from him, giving him space, but remaining close enough to let the boy know he wasn't alone. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound the occasional clink of the cup against the saucer. The boy stared into the drink, his fingers wrapped tightly around the mug as though holding onto something that made him feel safe. David knew that silence was often more comforting than words, especially when someone was hurting. Finally, after what felt like a long time, the boy spoke again. "I don't have anywhere to go," he said quietly, almost as if he hadn't meant to say it aloud. David didn't rush to answer. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression filled with understanding. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. The boy's eyes darted around the room, avoiding David's gaze. "I ran away," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My dad, he doesn't care. No one does. I just don't want to be there anymore." David's heart went out to him. He could hear the weight of the boy's words, the loneliness and abandonment that clung to them. The pastor didn't ask for details. It was enough to know that this child was in pain, and right now he needed a safe space. "Do you have a name?" David asked softly. The boy hesitated before answering, almost as though he was afraid to share it. "Ben," he said finally, his voice small. "Well, Ben," David said, smiling warmly. "You're safe here. You're not alone." The boy didn't respond, but David could see the flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps hope, or perhaps just the quiet comfort of knowing that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't being judged. David didn't know exactly what would come next, but in that moment, he made a silent promise to himself and to Ben. He would do whatever he could to help him. The boy's journey was far from over, but maybe this was the first step toward something better. The night passed quietly. Ben stayed in the church, not out of obligation, but because it was the only place he felt safe. David made him a bed in one of the small rooms at the back of the church, and as the boy drifted to sleep, David sat quietly by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had made the right choice. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt at peace, knowing he had made a difference in the life of a boy who had no one else. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new routine for Ben. The pastor, David, kept his word and did everything he could to help him feel safe and cared for. Every day was a small victory, a step away from the dark memories of the past. The boy's initial hesitation to trust slowly faded, replaced by a quiet gratitude and an increasing sense of comfort in the church's warmth. David made sure Ben had everything he needed. The small church was more than just a place of worship. It was a sanctuary, a home for those in need, and Ben, despite his rough exterior, began to open up little by little. Each morning David made breakfast for them both, often pancakes or eggs, and they would sit at the small wooden table in the kitchen. David would ask how Ben had slept, and though the boy's answers were short at first, there was a slight change. He wasn't avoiding the question or giving one-word responses anymore. He was starting to trust the routine, to feel a little more settled. "Did you sleep okay last night?" David asked one morning as he poured Ben a glass of orange juice. Ben nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, better than before." David smiled back, placing the plate of pancakes in front of him. "Good, I'm glad." For Ben, mornings were different now. They weren't filled with uncertainty and fear. There was something peaceful about the church in the mornings, the quiet hum of the world waking up outside, the sun slowly spilling through the windows, and the smell of fresh coffee and pancakes filling the air. He had never known peace like this, and at first he didn't know how to accept it. But over time he started to embrace it. After breakfast, they would spend time talking. Sometimes it was about simple things. David would ask about what Ben liked to do, and the boy would tell him about his love for drawing. He had always been good with a pencil, sketching anything that came to mind. Sometimes he would draw the church itself, or the trees outside, or even his own face, trying to capture something of himself that he could not quite express in words. David encouraged him to keep drawing. "You've got talent, Ben," he'd say. "You should nurture that. It could be a way for you to tell your story." The idea of sharing his story through art was new to Ben, but it made sense. He didn't have the words to explain everything he felt. But through his sketches, he could create images that told the truth. And so, each day, Ben spent a little more time with his pencil, sketching quietly in the corner of the church. David didn't rush him. He simply let the boy find his own way. In the evenings, after they'd eaten dinner, David would often invite Ben to join him in the small office at the back of the church. He didn't pressure him to talk, but there was always a quiet invitation for Ben to share if he felt ready. Most nights, Ben would remain silent, watching the flickering candlelight or the dim glow of the desk lamp. But there was a shift happening. The boy was beginning to relax, beginning to feel like maybe he could trust the world around him again. One evening, as they sat together, David asked if Ben had ever gone to school. Ben's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I went a little, but I didn't stay long." David nodded, understanding. "What about now? Would you want to try again?" Ben looked down at his hands, unsure. "I don't know. I haven't really been in a classroom for a long time." David leaned forward, his voice kind but firm. "We can make it happen if you want. I think you've got a lot of potential. And I can help you, Ben. You don't have to do this alone." For the first time in weeks, Ben looked up, meeting David's gaze. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes, something he hadn't felt for a long time. "You think so?" "I do," David replied, smiling gently. "I believe in you." The next day, David took Ben to a nearby school, explaining the situation to the principal. It wasn't easy for Ben. The idea of going back to school after so long felt overwhelming, and he was nervous about meeting new people. But David was with him every step of the way, offering encouragement and a calm presence that helped him take that first big step. Over the next few weeks, Ben began to attend school again, though it wasn't easy. The other kids noticed he was different. He was quieter, more withdrawn than most. And he didn't fit in with the crowd, not yet. But slowly he began to find his place. There was one girl in his class who noticed him drawing during lunch. She was kind, offering him a smile whenever she saw him sketching away. At first, Ben didn't say much to her, but over time, they started talking about art. She told him about her own love for painting, and they began to share ideas and sketches. It was small moments like this that helped Ben build his confidence, that made him feel like he wasn't so alone in the world. The school day was still hard for him, filled with new faces and new challenges. But David's words echoed in his mind. You don't have to do this alone. Back at the church, life continued in its steady rhythm. David remained a constant source of support. After school, Ben would return to the church, often with his homework, which David would help him with. It was during these moments that the boy began to see just how much his life was changing. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was growing, learning, and most importantly, he was beginning to heal. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at school, Ben came home to find David sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The pastor could see the boy's frustration, the way his shoulders were hunched as if carrying a weight that no one could see. Without saying a word, David gestured for Ben to sit down. He didn't ask about the day or pressure him to talk. He just sat with him, the silence comfortable and safe. After a few moments, Ben spoke quietly. I don't know if I can keep doing this. David looked at him, his expression gentle but firm. You can, and you don't have to do it alone. You have people who care about you, people who want to see you succeed. Ben shook his head, his eyes filled with doubt. But what if I'm not good enough? You are good enough, Ben, David said, his voice calm. You don't have to be perfect. Just take it one day at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just keep going and I'll be here. Ben's eyes searched David's face, looking for some sign that this wasn't just empty reassurance. And for the first time, he realized that it wasn't empty. It was real. David genuinely cared about him, and that made all the difference. Over the next few months, Ben continued to struggle with his schoolwork, but with David's help, he kept going. He worked through his doubts and fears, slowly building the confidence he needed to face the challenges ahead. And though the road was long, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The weeks turned into months, and as time passed, Ben's life continued to improve, though not without its challenges. He had settled into a new routine, one that no longer felt like a series of uphill battles. Every day he got up, went to school, and returned to the church where David was always waiting with a kind word, a cup of tea, or a gentle piece of advice. Slowly, the boy started to embrace the small victories, things he hadn't thought possible before. At school, things were getting easier too. The other kids had grown used to Ben's quiet nature. He didn't try to fit in with the crowd. He didn't need to. He had his art, and that was enough for him. He spent hours after school sketching, experimenting with colors and shapes, allowing his emotions to spill out onto the page. And the more he drew, the more he realized how much he loved it. Art had become his escape, his way of expressing everything he couldn't say with words. One afternoon, as Ben sat in the small room at the back of the church, sketching out a scene from his imagination, David came in with a gentle knock on the door. Hey Ben, how's the art coming along? He asked, leaning against the door frame. Ben looked up from his drawing, a slight smile crossing his face. It's good. I'm getting better, I think. David nodded, stepping into the room and sitting down across from him. I can see that. You've been working really hard? Ben shrugged, not used to receiving praise. I like it. It helps me. I don't know, feel something. He looked at the page for a moment before adding, like it makes sense, you know. David smiled. I do know. Art has a way of doing that. For a moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ben was used to the quiet now. He had learned to enjoy it, to appreciate the calm moments that allowed him to think and reflect. You ever think about what you want to do with your art? David asked gently. Ben looked up at him, his eyes wide. What do you mean? David leaned forward, his gaze steady but encouraging. You've got talent, Ben. You've got a gift. Maybe one day you could share it with others. Maybe even make a career out of it. Ben shook his head slightly, uncertainty flashing across his face. I don't know. I never thought about it that way. I just draw to get my mind off things, David smiled. That's a great reason to do it. But don't sell yourself short. If this is something you love, then maybe it's something you could pursue more seriously. The idea sat with Ben, stirring something deep within him. Could he really make something of his passion? Could he really turn his drawings into something more than just a way to pass the time? He didn't know, but for the first time it felt like something was possible. But life wasn't always as easy as drawing or school. Ben still struggled with his past. The memories of the life he'd left behind, the confusion and pain crept into his thoughts when he least expected it. There were days when he woke up feeling like the weight of it all was too much to carry. He still missed the feeling of being truly safe, truly loved. He knew David cared about him, but sometimes the past felt so heavy that it clouded everything else. One evening, after a particularly hard day at school, Ben came home to find David sitting by the window, looking out at the fading sunset. The pastor didn't turn when Ben entered, but his voice was soft. "You seem a little distant today," David said, his tone gentle as if he already knew what was on Ben's mind. Ben hesitated, standing in the doorway for a moment. He didn't want to burden David with his worries. He was supposed to be getting better, supposed to be moving forward. But the truth was, the past wasn't something he could just forget. It clung to him like a shadow, always there even on his best days. "I'm fine," Ben said, his voice almost too quiet. David didn't buy it. He knew Ben well enough by now to understand when something was wrong. "You know you can talk to me, right? Whatever it is, it's okay. You don't have to carry it alone." For a long time, Ben stood in the doorway, unable to find the right words. Finally, he walked over to the table where David sat and sat down across from him. He didn't say anything at first, just ran his fingers across the surface of the table, his mind racing. "It's just, I don't know how to keep moving forward," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some days it feels like I'm making progress, but then other days, it's like everything I've worked for just falls apart. Like I'm still that scared kid, lost and alone." David looked at him with a mixture of understanding and compassion. "I get it, Ben, I really do. But you have to remember that healing isn't a straight line. There will be ups and downs. The important thing is that you keep going even when it feels hard." Ben swallowed, trying to hold back the lump in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words until now. For so long he had felt like he was walking this road by himself, that his past was something he had to conquer alone. But David's words felt like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of his doubts. "I know," Ben said quietly, "but some days I don't know how." David smiled gently. "That's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. But just remember, you've already come so far. You're not the same person you were when you first walked through those doors. You've already proven to yourself that you're stronger than you think." Ben looked at him, a small spark of hope igniting within him. He hadn't realized how much he needed reassurance until this moment. Maybe David was right. Maybe he could keep going. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he had once thought. As the days passed, Ben began to realize that the key to moving forward wasn't just about pushing through the hard days. It was about accepting that the journey would be messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful, but that didn't mean he wasn't making progress. Every small step, every moment of growth was a victory, and David would be there every step of the way, reminding him that he didn't have to walk this road alone. In the weeks that followed, Ben's confidence grew. His art continued to improve, and he started to believe that maybe one day he could pursue it more seriously. But more importantly, he began to let go of some of the pain that had held him back for so long. He wasn't fully healed, but he was moving in the right direction. And that, for Ben, was enough for now. The months continued to pass, and Ben's life felt like it was slowly but steadily falling into place. He had learned not to expect everything to be perfect, but he had also learned that it was okay to take things one step at a time. The feeling of being in control, of having a future ahead of him, became more real with each passing day. At school, Ben was no longer the quiet, withdrawn boy who had first walked through the doors. He was still reserved, but he had started to make friends. Real friends. They were the kind of friends who didn't care that he didn't speak much, who didn't pressure him to be something he wasn't. They accepted him for who he was. One of his closest friends was a boy named Jake, a kind-hearted kid who shared Ben's interest in drawing. They spent hours after school sketching in the park, their notebooks filled with images of their favorite places and the things they imagined. Jake was the first person who ever saw the potential in Ben's art. "You've got something special, man," Jake told him one afternoon, sitting under the big oak tree in the park. "You should think about showing people your work. People would love to see this." Ben didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not about something so personal to him. "I don't know," he said, looking down at his sketch pad. "I just draw for me. It's not that big of a deal." Jake shrugged. "Well, maybe you're not giving it enough credit. I think it's a big deal. You never know what could happen if you shared it with the world." The idea sat with Ben, bouncing around in his mind, refusing to be ignored. He had never really thought about showing anyone his art, let alone making a career out of it. But what if Jake was right? What if he could do something with this passion? It was a thought he couldn't shake. At the church, David noticed the change in Ben, too. The boy was more confident now, more sure of himself. He still had moments of doubt, but they were fewer. He was learning to believe in himself, and that was something that David had always hoped for him. The pastor had watched Ben grow, not just in his art, but in his ability to face life's challenges head-on. One evening, as they sat together in the church, David asked Ben about his day. Ben smiled, his eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. "It was a good day," he said, his voice more relaxed. "I had art class, and Jake said I should start sharing my work. He thinks people would like it." David raised an eyebrow. "Is that something you want to do?" Ben thought for a moment. "I don't know. I've never really thought about showing anyone my stuff, but maybe it's worth trying." David smiled, his eyes full of encouragement. "I think that's a great idea. If it's something you're passionate about, why not share it with the world? You have a gift, Ben. It'd be a shame to keep it to yourself." For the first time, Ben considered the possibility that David was right. He had always kept his art private, but maybe it was time to take a chance. Maybe it was time to let others see what he could do. A few weeks later, Ben decided to take the leap. There was a small local art gallery in the town, and they were hosting an open call for new artists. It wasn't a huge opportunity, but it felt like the right first step. With encouragement from Jake and David, Ben submitted a few of his best pieces. He was nervous, unsure if his art would even be considered, but there was a part of him that was excited to finally share what he had been working on. When he received an email saying that his pieces had been accepted into the gallery, Ben couldn't believe it. He sat at the small desk in his room, staring at the screen, trying to process the words. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the first time in his life, he felt like something he had done mattered to someone other than himself. The night of the gallery opening was surreal. Ben stood in the crowded room, surrounded by strangers, all admiring the artwork on the walls. It was a strange feeling, knowing that people were looking at his work and appreciating it. He had always kept his art private, but now it felt like it was part of something bigger than himself. Jake was with him, standing by his side, just as excited as Ben was. "Look at this, man," Jake said, nodding toward a group of people admiring one of Ben's pieces. "They're really into it. You're doing it. You're sharing your gift with the world." Ben smiled, his nerves still buzzing, but there was a quiet sense of pride in his chest. He had done it. He had taken a step into a new world, one that had once felt far beyond his reach. For the first time in a long time, Ben felt like he belonged somewhere. He wasn't just a kid with a troubled past anymore. He was an artist, someone whose work could touch others. As the night went on, Ben received compliments from strangers who had stopped to admire his pieces. Some of them asked if he had more work for sale. Others simply told him how much they appreciated his talent. It was all overwhelming, but it was also exhilarating. This was the kind of attention he had never thought he would receive. And it was a reminder that he had a future beyond the church, beyond the small town he had always called home. By the end of the night, Ben was exhausted but happy. He and Jake walked home together, the night air cool and fresh. Ben couldn't stop smiling, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "You were amazing tonight," Jake said, clapping him on the back. "You've got a future ahead of you, Ben. I really believe that." Ben didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was open to the possibilities. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more days when he would doubt himself. But that was okay. He had come so far already, and he knew that, with people like David and Jake by his side, he could keep moving forward. The next day, when Ben walked into the church after school, he found David sitting at the same table where they had shared so many quiet moments. The pastor looked up and smiled when he saw Ben. "Well, how did it go?" David asked, his voice full of curiosity. Ben grinned, his eyes shining. It went great. People actually liked my work. I think they're going to buy some of it. David stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. I'm proud of you, Ben. I knew you had it in you. Ben's smile grew wider, and for the first time he felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. His past had been filled with pain, but now he was creating something new. He was building a future, one that was filled with hope and possibility. And as long as he kept taking those steps forward, he knew that he would continue to grow, continue to heal, and continue to become the person he had always wanted to be. The years passed, and Ben continued to grow, not just in his art but in every aspect of his life. He had come so far from the scared, lonely boy who had first walked through the church doors. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still days when the weight of his past would resurface, but the difference now was that Ben knew he was stronger than the shadows that sometimes crept in. He was no longer running from his past. He was building a future. As his art continued to gain recognition, Ben's confidence grew. He started to participate in more exhibitions, and his work was featured in several local galleries. People began to notice him not just as the quiet boy with a sketchbook, but as an artist with a real talent. His pieces told stories of struggle, hope, and resilience. Each drawing was a piece of himself, and it seemed as though the world was beginning to understand him in a way he had always hoped for. It was a rainy evening when Ben returned to the church after his latest exhibition. The event had gone well, but as he walked through the familiar doors of the church, something felt different. There was an unfamiliar quiet in the air, a stillness that seemed out of place. He walked through the hallways, his footsteps echoing off the walls, and found David sitting at his usual spot by the window. The pastor didn't turn when Ben entered, but he could feel the tension in the room. "Everything okay, David?" Ben asked, his voice soft. David looked up, his face lined with a mix of concern and contemplation. "Ben, there's something I need to talk to you about," he said, his voice calm but serious. Ben's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" David gestured for him to sit down. "It's not bad news exactly, but I've been thinking about how far you've come and what comes next." Ben sat down across from him, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I'm doing okay. I'm still showing my art and everything's going well." David smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It's not about your art, Ben. You've done incredible things with your life. But I can see that you've outgrown this place, and I think it's time for you to take the next step. You're ready for something bigger, something beyond what you've known here." The words hit Ben like a wave. He had always known that he was growing, that he was moving towards something greater. But to hear David say it out loud, to have him acknowledge that Ben was ready to leave the safety of the church, it felt like a strange and bittersweet moment. "David," Ben said slowly, his voice shaking slightly, "you've been like a father to me. How am I supposed to leave all this behind?" David leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You've never been alone, Ben. You've never had to face anything on your own. I've always been here for you, and I always will be. But there comes a time when we all have to spread our wings and find our own path. You've already started that journey, and now it's time to take the next step. It's scary, I know, but I believe in you." Ben sat in silence for a long time, his thoughts racing. He had always been scared of leaving. The church had been his safe space, his home when he had nowhere else to turn. But David was right. He had grown, and he couldn't stay where he was forever. His art had taken him places he never imagined, and now the world outside of the church was calling him. "I'm scared," Ben admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I fail? What if I don't make it out there?" David smiled, his expression filled with warmth. "Failure is a part of life, Ben. It doesn't define you. What matters is that you keep moving forward. You've already proven to yourself how strong you are. This next step is yours to take." Ben took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside him. It felt like everything he had worked for, everything he had learned, was leading to this moment. He was ready to step out on his own, to take what he had learned and use it to build a future. But it was still hard to let go of the past, to leave the people and the place that had shaped him. "I'll miss this place," Ben said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll miss you." David reached out and placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. "You don't have to leave everything behind. The church will always be here for you, and I will always be here for you. This is just a new chapter, not an end. Ben smiled, a small but genuine smile. For the first time, he felt like he could face the future with hope, not fear. He knew there would still be struggles ahead, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had the love and support of David, and the lessons he had learned in the church would stay with him, guiding him through whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, Ben packed up his things. It wasn't easy to leave the place that had been his refuge for so long, but as he did, he felt a sense of excitement begin to replace the sadness. He was stepping into the unknown, yes, but he was ready. He had a vision for his future, and he wasn't going to let anything hold him back. The night before he left, David invited Ben to sit down one last time in the church. It was late, and the two of them sat in the quiet surrounded by the soft glow of the candlelight. "You've come so far," David said, his voice filled with pride. "You've made a life for yourself, Ben. I'm proud of you." Ben smiled, feeling the weight of the moment. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You gave me a chance when no one else did." David shook his head. "You did it all yourself. I just helped you see the possibilities." They sat in silence for a while, neither one needing to say anything more. The bond between them was unspoken, but it was there, strong and unbreakable. No matter where Ben went, David would always be a part of his journey. The next day, Ben left the church. He moved to a new city where his art took on a life of its own. He found new friends, new opportunities, and new challenges. He continued to grow, to evolve, and to create. The world he had once thought was too big, too overwhelming, had become his canvas. Years later, Ben would look back on that moment, the day he left the church, the day David told him it was time to fly, and he would realize that it was the moment everything changed. He had stepped into the unknown, unsure of what awaited him, but with the knowledge that he had everything he needed to succeed. And though his journey had been long, the lessons he had learned, the people he had met, and the art he had created along the way made it all worthwhile. David had been right. Ben wasn't alone. He had built a future for himself, one that was full of possibility, one that was uniquely his. And as he stood in front of a new canvas ready to create his next masterpiece, Ben knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Years had passed since Ben had left the church. The city had become his new home, a place where he could make a name for himself and build the life he had always dreamed of. The transition wasn't easy. There were challenges along the way, moments of doubt when he questioned whether he had made the right decision. But now, looking around at the life he had created, Ben knew it had been worth every step, every struggle. His art had become well known in the city, featured in numerous galleries, and even sold to collectors who appreciated the raw emotion he poured into every piece. Each painting, each sketch was an expression of who he had become. But more than that, his work had touched others in ways he hadn't expected. His art was more than just pictures on a canvas. It was a story, a message of hope, of overcoming the darkness that once threatened to consume him. One evening, as he sat in his studio, the soft hum of city life drifting in through the window, Ben found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He had a busy schedule, exhibitions lined up, and his work was starting to attract attention from all over. Yet, despite the success, there was a part of him that felt empty. He had achieved so much, but something was missing. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was David. A wave of warmth filled Ben's chest. He hadn't spoken to him in a while, but they kept in touch now and then. David had always been there for him, guiding him through the hardest parts of his journey. Ben answered the phone with a smile. "Hey, David, it's been a while." "Ben, it's good to hear your voice," David said, his tone as familiar and comforting as it had been all those years ago. "How are you?" "I'm doing well," Ben replied. "Work's busy, you know how it is. But I'm good. How about you?" "I'm all right," David said. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. How things have been going for you out there?" Ben paused, sensing that there was more to this conversation. "Everything's going great, but there's something on your mind, isn't there?" David chuckled softly. "You always did know when something was up." "You're right, there's something I wanted to talk to you about." "I've been hearing some things around town. People are talking about you, Ben. They're proud of you. But it seems like you've been keeping to yourself a lot lately. And I just wanted to remind you that you don't have to do this alone." Ben felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so caught up in his own success, in building his future, that he had neglected the things that truly mattered. He had spent so much time proving himself to the world that he had forgotten about the people who had been there for him when he had nothing. I guess I've been so focused on everything that I forgot about, well, you, Ben admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. You were there when I had nothing, David. You helped me become who I am today. And I guess I just got busy. David's voice softened. Ben, I'm proud of everything you've accomplished. But remember, you can't build a future without remembering the people who helped you along the way. You're not meant to do this alone. I'm here, just like I always have been. And there are people in your life who want to be there for you too. Ben sat in silence, reflecting on David's words. He had been so consumed by the idea of success that he had pushed away the very things that had helped him reach it. He realized that, no matter how far he had come, he still needed the support of the people who had believed in him from the beginning. I know you're right, Ben said, finally breaking the silence. I've just been so focused on myself. Maybe I've been afraid that if I let people in, it'll all come crashing down. But I don't want to be alone anymore. David's voice was gentle but firm. You don't have to be, Ben. You never have to be. After that conversation, Ben spent the next few days reflecting on his life. He realized how much he had missed the quiet moments, the moments of connection that had once been so important to him. He had been so focused on building his career that he had lost touch with the people who had truly mattered. The truth was, he wasn't happy in the way he had thought he would be. Success had its rewards, but it didn't fill the emptiness inside. Ben decided it was time to make a change. He reached out to some of his old friends from the town, people he had lost touch with over the years. He made a plan to visit the church again, to reconnect with David and see the place that had been his refuge. It wasn't about running away from his life in the city. It was about remembering where he came from and rediscovering the connections that had shaped him. A few weeks later, Ben found himself standing in front of the church once again. It looked the same as he remembered. The old stone walls, the weathered wooden doors, the quiet, peaceful atmosphere that had always been a comfort. He took a deep breath, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. It had been so long since he had stepped inside these walls, but the memories were still fresh in his mind. As he entered the church, he was greeted by the familiar smell of wood and incense, the same quiet serenity that had always been there. David was sitting in the same spot by the window, just as Ben had remembered. Ben, David said with a smile, standing up to greet him. It's good to see you again. Ben smiled, his heart full of gratitude. It's good to be here. They sat together talking for hours, catching up on everything that had happened since Ben had left. The conversation flowed easily as it always had. It was as though no time had passed at all. Ben realized that despite everything he had accomplished, there was something irreplaceable about the connection he had with David, something that success could never replace. Later that evening, as the sun set and the church became quiet, Ben stood by the window looking out at the town. It felt like a different world now, a world that was both familiar and new. He had changed and the world around him had changed too. But some things, like the love and support of the people who cared about him, remained constant. For the first time in a long time, Ben felt a sense of peace. He knew that he had made the right decision to come back, to reconnect with his roots. The journey had been long and the road ahead would continue to have its challenges, but Ben was no longer afraid. He had learned that success wasn't just about what you achieved. It was about the people you shared your journey with, the relationships that grounded you and the love that kept you going. As he walked away from the church that night, Ben knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had a future ahead of him, one that was full of possibility, but more importantly, it was a future that was filled with the love and support of the people who had always believed in him. And that, he realized, was the greatest success of all. The weeks that followed Ben's return to the church were filled with quiet reflection and growth. It was a time of reconnecting with the past and redefining his future. He spent hours talking with David, discussing everything from his art to his goals, and the conversations always seemed to leave him feeling centered and grounded. Ben had learned a lot in the years since he left, but there was something comforting about coming back to the place that had given him his first sense of stability. Though the city had been good to him, Ben had realized that it wasn't the success or the recognition that brought him peace. It was the people he had met along the way, the ones who had shown him what true support and love looked like, and now he was ready to give back. He knew he could use his platform to inspire others the way David had inspired him. One afternoon, As Ben sat with David at the kitchen table in the church, a thought began to form in his mind. He hadn't spoken about it yet, but he knew it was time to take another leap. David was listening intently as Ben shared his plans for the future. "I've been thinking," Ben started, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "I want to do something bigger, something that brings art into places that need it most. I want to open an art program for kids, maybe in schools or in communities that don't have access to this kind of thing." David leaned forward, his eyes bright with understanding. "I think that's a beautiful idea, Ben. You've always had a gift for helping others see things in a different way. You could change lives." Ben nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "I want to create a space where kids can learn, express themselves, and be part of something bigger. Art gave me a way out when I didn't know how to speak. I want to give that same chance to others." David smiled, his voice full of encouragement. "You've got a lot of heart, Ben, and you're right. Art has the power to heal, to give people a voice. You can make this happen. Just take it one step at a time, and remember, you don't have to do it alone." The idea of starting an art program filled Ben with excitement. He could already see it in his mind. A place where kids could gather, learn from each other, and use art as a way to tell their stories. But he also knew it would take a lot of work. He would need to find funding, connect with schools, and get the community involved. It felt like a huge challenge, but for the first time in a long time, Ben wasn't afraid. He was ready to put his heart into something that could make a difference. The next few weeks were filled with meetings and phone calls. Ben reached out to local schools, community centers, and businesses, explaining his vision for the art program. Some people were skeptical, but others saw the potential and wanted to be part of it. He was able to secure some funding from local organizations and even got a few artists in the area to volunteer their time to help teach. Slowly but surely, things started to come together. The space for the program was secured, a small room in a community center not far from the church. Ben began to recruit volunteers, people who were passionate about art and wanted to help make a difference in the lives of young people. And as the first day of the program drew near, Ben felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This was it. This was the beginning of something new. The first day of the program was everything Ben had hoped for and more. A group of eager kids showed up, some with sketchbooks, some with nothing but curiosity in their eyes. There was a mix of ages and backgrounds, but they all shared one thing: a desire to create. Ben greeted them all with a warm smile, introducing himself and explaining what they would be doing over the next few weeks. "Art is a way for you to express yourselves," Ben told them. "It doesn't matter if you're good at it or not. What matters is that you show up and put your heart into it. This is your space to explore and create." As the weeks went by, Ben watched as the kids began to blossom. At first, some of them were hesitant. They weren't sure if they were good enough or if their ideas would be accepted. But slowly, they began to open up, sharing their thoughts through drawings, paintings, and sculptures. Ben was amazed at how quickly they embraced the process, how they started to see the power in their own creativity. There was one girl in particular, Mia, who stood out to Ben. She was shy at first, barely speaking as she sat in the back of the room, sketching in her notebook. But one day, after a few weeks of working together, she brought in a piece of artwork that took Ben by surprise. It was a portrait of her family, painted with such emotion and detail that it left him speechless. "Mia, this is incredible," Ben said, his voice full of admiration. "You've really captured something special here." Mia's face lit up with a shy smile. "I've never really drawn before," she said quietly, "but it felt like I needed to tell this story." Ben placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's the power of art. You've told a beautiful story with your work." Mia's confidence grew from that moment on. She began to participate more, showing her work to the other kids and encouraging them to share their own stories. She was a quiet leader, someone who inspired others with her vulnerability and creativity. As the program continued, Ben saw more and more kids coming out of their shells. They didn't just learn how to create. They learned how to express themselves, how to communicate their feelings and thoughts in a way that words sometimes couldn't capture. Ben realized that this was the real gift of art, not just the ability to make something beautiful, but the ability to share a piece of yourself with the world. One afternoon, after another successful class, Ben sat down with David to reflect on the progress they had made. David had come by to check on the program, and he was impressed with how much it had grown. "You've really done something special here, Ben," David said, his voice full of pride. "These kids are lucky to have you as a teacher." Ben smiled, but he didn't take all the credit. "It's not just me, David, it's the kids too. They've taught me just as much as I've taught them." David chuckled softly. "That's the beauty of teaching. You give, but you also receive." Ben thought about that for a moment. He had given so much of himself to this program, but he had received something in return that was even more valuable. A sense of purpose, a feeling that he was truly making a difference. And as he watched the kids' artwork fill the walls of the community center, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The program continued to grow, and Ben found himself more fulfilled than he had ever been before. He wasn't just creating art for himself anymore. He was helping others find their own voices, showing them that their stories were worth telling. One day, as the program wrapped up for the summer, Ben stood in front of the kids, his heart full of gratitude. "You've all done something incredible," he said, his voice full of emotion. "You've created pieces of yourself, and I'm so proud of each and every one of you. Keep creating, keep telling your stories. You have a gift, and the world needs to see it."